In today's video I will show you how I painted up my new favorite model from the old world releases, the standard bearer on Royal Pegasus. But we won't stop there. In the second half of the video I will go through all the mistakes I made while I was painting the model so you can avoid them in your own project.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Phalanx Miniatures. When I set out to paint this model, I looked up some references, especially back from the old world. Most of those paint jobs were simpler in terms of technique than what I would expect today, but they had two things in common. One, they were super vibrant and colorful in general, and two, they relied a lot on adding extra detail on the models with free-handed patterns and multicolored panels on shields and fabrics. So my plan was to go with something like that, but mixing in some more contemporary painting techniques. Something like what I did on the Free Guild Marshal, but instead of the more realistic, moodier color palette, trying out something with really vibrant colors. So in the first part of the video, let's take a look at how I achieved that. I will show you all the colors and talk you through the thinking and painting process. Then in the second half of the video I will address some of the mistakes I made, and I made a few, so you guys can avoid them if you want to do something similar on your own models.
Let's start with the stars of the show, the two colors that will make or break my attempt to do a really vibrant and colorful miniature, the reds and the blues.
My plan was quite simple in principle, but a bit trickier in execution. I picked a color, royal purple, for my undercoat that would work as a shadow color for both the red and the blue. If you paint simply blue or red with the same colored but darker shadows, you will never achieve a truly colorful model in my experience. You need some nice complementary colors in the shadows for the blues and the reds to truly pop. Once I had the purple down, I had to make a couple of decisions about where I wanted the colors to be. I decided to make the two sides mirror each other in terms of where I place the blues and the reds on the model. For example, the fabric hanging under the saddle is red on the left side of the Pegasus but blue on the right side. Consequently, the fabrics around it, like the one on the neck of the horse and the skirt-like thing covering his back, are red on the left side as well, so they contrast well with the blue in between them. And this is relatively easy on things that are a single color, but certain things like the standard and the shields, for example, I wanted to make a bit more interesting by adding a 4-quarter design. So here I essentially did a very basic freehand and divided the area into 4 different segments.
As for the technique, I had an interesting choice to make because the old world models, especially the older ones, but even this one, had way less details on them than what we are used to in today's models. On the old paint jobs, the highlights were relatively simply done, so they had to somehow fill out all these large plain surfaces, and they did so with freehands and different color patterns.
But here I wanted to break up those big surfaces like the flag, for example, with volumetric highlights and textures instead, and we will talk in the mistakes section later on about some of the mistakes I made with this. I will put the colors I used on the screen if you want to go for a similar look, but the idea was very simple. I sketched in the highlights with the brush, making sure that I achieved full coverage in the middle of the highlight. And then I added some texture around it to create some details on the large surfaces and to make it easier to blend the two colors later. Once I was done with the blue, I did the same thing with the red as well, once again going with a mix of red and purple first to make it easier to blend the two layers. And for the next step, I went up one level higher in brightness, so pure deep blue and Cartacci red respectively, and continued working inside the previous highlights and then doing the texture around the new one. And now it was time to do some smoothing with the airbrush. First, I used the two main colors again, deep blue and Cartacci red, but very diluted, and I shot them in between the shadows and the highlights, blurring the edges together. The nice thing about these two colors is that they also work as shadow colors for each other. So I was able to use the blue not only to smooth out the blue transitions, but also to darken and smooth the red shadows as well. And on the other hand, I used the red to smooth the reds obviously, but also sprayed it in the blue shadows to smooth them out too. Wherever I felt I needed a bit more contrast and color, I sprayed a bit of royal purple into the shadows as well. From this point on, it became a simple repetition of the same process with brighter and brighter colors and an airbrush smoothing phase after each of them before moving on to the next one until I reached a mix of deep sky blue and ice yellow on the blue parts and orange on the red parts. In addition to the big volumetric highlights, I also kept adding edge highlights and separation lines on the borders of the colors as well with these new brighter and brighter colors.
Once I was done with the two main colors, I left the Pegasus for now unpainted and moved on to the secondary colors. I wasn't yet sure how to paint the mounts, so I decided to finish everything else first.
Next, I did all the non-metallic metal gold trim, paying attention to use paints with a lot of colors and vibrancy. You can check out the list of colors on the screen once again if you want to try your hand at it yourself. I wanted to go for a nice old gold look to go with the other vibrant colors on the model. You can never go wrong with a combination of blue, red and yellow. Just look at the costume of Superman, it just works. I will talk about this more in the mistakes section, but I was really struggling to do this on the banner. It was just so damn high and it was difficult to stabilize my hand well enough to do the edges. But with a bit of effort I managed to get it more or less done. Then I did a simple beaten up leather with my usual recipe, concentrating on highlighting the edges and adding scratches and imperfections to make it look more like the actual material I wanted to represent. The leather is not very prominent on this model though, so I wasn't paying as much attention to it as to some of the more important elements. The steel armor pieces on the other hand are quite visible and important, especially the one covering the head of the horse. I used one of my favorite recipes for blue steel for this, going from anthracite grey up to almost pure white. I quite liked how this turned out, especially on the legs of the rider, where I felt that I managed to nail the light placement quite well. It is a shame that the wings will cover the whole thing and no one will see it, but I'll talk about viewing angles in the mistakes section later.
Okay, now the only thing left was to paint the Pegasus itself, and I needed to use the same colors for the body as well as the wings. But I ended up using very different techniques for them.
On the body, I simply highlighted it up from reddish grey up to ivory on the highest highlights. But on the wings that would have taken me ages, so I decided to cut some corners and try my hand at dry brushing, considering that the wings are basically the perfect example of a surface made for this technique with all the surface details provided by the feathers. The funny thing is that I've never used dry brushing on a model before in my life for whatever reason. I use it regularly on bases, so I have some experience with it, but this was the first time I ever tried it on an actual model. So I ended up using a cork sheet as my palette, since I heard that ideally you shouldn't use a paper towel to remove the excess paint, since it will suck the moisture out of the brush. I'm not sure how much it contributed, but I was quite happy with the result in the end. I even managed to take the placement of the wings into account, leaving the underside of the wings where they would be in shadow darker and highlighting the parts where the light would hit more. And since I felt guilty for cutting corners, I went in with the brush to correct some of the mistakes and to add a layer of pure white highlights in the most visible areas. And after attaching the wings and painting in some of the smaller details, it ended up looking like this.
I think I actually managed to achieve the original goal, since it's quite vibrant and striking. But unfortunately this was still one of the most problematic paint jobs I have painted lately. So let's take a look at some of these issues and mistakes I made so that you can avoid them.
I actually made the first mistake already at the assembly stage. If you watched my 10 miniature painting mistakes video, you probably know that I hate sub-assemblies. And yet, you just saw me paint the wings separately and attach them later. The thing is that sometimes you just have to do sub-assemblies. It would have been almost impossible to handle the model with the wings on. The problem is that I didn't go far enough. I should have painted the standard separately as well, because with it on, the model was so tall that it was very difficult to find a painting position where I could have my hand and fingers braced enough to paint smaller details. As soon as I put any pressure on it, the flag threatened to snap off. And unfortunately this problem spiraled into other issues as well. Since I couldn't brace my hand properly, I got sloppy with my highlights and the textures I was doing around them. The brush marks ended up being too large and too obvious. And this in turn made them harder to blend, which led to more mistakes with the airbrush than I would have done otherwise. When I felt that it is not covering well enough, instead of being patient, I started trying too hard, creating spider webbing and hitting places that I could have easily avoided otherwise. And then of course I needed to correct some of those mistakes, which didn't always end up looking as good as a single first attempt would. And the result is a less than perfect surface that looks much worse than I could normally achieve. The sad thing here is that I knew this would happen when I decided to glue the arm with the flag, but I was like, meh, I hate sub-assemblies, I will figure it out during the painting. Well, I didn't. But there are also downsides to painting in sub-assemblies as well. Halfway through the painting I was so enmeshed in the process that I completely forgot that this model has wings, since, you know, they were not attached. So I put a ton of effort into the sides of the model, which are barely visible when those huge feathery things are actually there. Only towards the end of the project did I actually realize that the only viable angle to view this model from is from the front, looking up at the rider, as you can see on the box art. An angle that I wasn't exactly concentrating on, so now I had to scramble and make some alterations that were once again not as good as my original efforts. Moving on from the sub-assemblies, my next big mistake was my highlight placement on the banner. I made the very typical mistake of only concentrating on the part that I was painting and not the entire object for the light placement. I painted the blue and the red highlights independently without syncing up their placements. The blue and the red squares might be different colors, but they are still the same material and part of the same shape, so the highlights running through them should be connected and not two independent things. And I noticed it only on the second highlight layer when the highlights started to take shape and after the first airbrush glazing stage, which made it even harder to fix. Another mistake was not to plan my process fully. Instead of adding a couple of stages where I used the airbrush, I was adding too many steps, making the process a bit too convoluted and messy. But my biggest mistake in general was impatience. Everything that I have just listed could have been avoided if I paid more attention and took my time. But unfortunately, rushing things also led to other smaller problems, like, for example, I hate doing transfers, so I tend to rush through the process and mess it up. This time I was simply too impatient to wait for the matte varnish to dry, and I applied another layer on top of the still wet one. Of course, it started to run and then created weird textures on the banner. Fortunately, I kinda liked them and they seemed part of the intended textures, but they were still not planned and could have been easily avoided. But to be honest, even the fact that I was using dry brushing for the wings shows that I simply didn't take my time with this model properly. But the end result still looks pretty cool to me, and I managed to learn a lot from these mistakes, so I guess all is well that ends well. And maybe listening to this, you guys can also avoid some of the same mistakes in the future.
Thank you very much for watching the video, and if you stuck around for this long, I assume you actually liked it, so maybe give it a like and subscribe because there's a lot more coming, and see you in the next one.